Before I explain what I found, I need to explain who I am and why I was even in a position to notice something most grandparents would have just complained about and walked away from. I spent 31 years working as a claims investigator for a regional insurance company, not the kind of investigator you see in movies chasing people through parking lots, the kind who sits at a desk and reads documents until the inconsistencies jump off the page. I retired 4 years ago, and if there is one skill that job left me with, it is this. When something does not add up on paper, I do not let it go until I understand why. My wife Diane and I live in a 55 and older community called Harrow Meadows, gated, quiet, mostly retirees, and a pool that the whole community treats as the social center of the neighborhood during the summer months. We do not have grandchildren living with us, but our daughter Melissa and her 2 kids, Ivy who is 7 and Nolan who is 9, live about 20 minutes away, and they come stay with us most weekends from May through September specifically for that pool. It has been that way for 6 years. The lifeguards know Ivy and Nolan by name. Other residents know them by name. They are, without exaggeration, part of the rhythm of that community every summer. In late May, a new sign appeared on the gate leading into the pool area. Laminated, taped at eye level, announcing that effective immediately, all visitors under the age of 18 would be required to present identification upon entry, and that this policy applied to grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and any other minor guest regardless of how frequently they visited. I remember reading that sign and thinking 2 things at once. First, that a 7-year-old does not typically carry identification, which made the policy borderline absurd on its face. Second, that something about the phrasing felt off in a way I could not immediately articulate, but that decades of reading claims paperwork had trained me to notice. Policies written for genuine safety reasons tend to explain the safety reasoning. This one did not explain anything. It simply announced a requirement and moved on. The following weekend, Melissa dropped the kids off for our usual Saturday, and around noon Diane took them down to the pool with their floaties and their sunscreen the way she always did. She came back up to the house 15 minutes later without them, visibly annoyed, and told me that a woman at the gate had stopped Ivy and Nolan and refused to let them in without identification. That woman was Sherry Poplawski, president of the Harrow Meadows Homeowners Association. I want to describe Sherry accurately because I think it matters for understanding how she was able to operate the way she did for as long as she did. She was not loud. She was not the type of HOA president who screamed at people in parking lots or fired off unhinged emails at midnight. She was calm, organized, almost clinical in the way she enforced rules, and that calmness made people trust her more than they probably should have. When Sherry told you something was a policy, you generally believed her because she never seemed uncertain when she said it. I walked down to the pool gate myself that afternoon. Ivy was standing there holding her floaty against her chest looking confused. Nolan was standing next to her with his arms crossed the way 9-year-olds do when they are trying very hard not to cry in public. And Sherry was standing at the gate with a laminated clipboard I had never seen before, checking names off against a list. I asked her politely at first what was going on. She told me the community had implemented a new visitor verification policy following what she described as concerns raised by several residents about unfamiliar children using the pool without proper supervision or accountability. I told her these were my grandchildren, that they had been coming to that pool for 6 years, that every lifeguard on staff could identify them by name. She told me she understood, but that the policy applied uniformly and that exceptions could not be made even for children she recognized, because that would defeat what she called the integrity of the system. I asked what the identification requirement actually accomplished if a 7-year-old obviously cannot produce a driver's license. She told me that for minors, the policy required either a birth certificate copy on file with the HOA office, or, and this is the part that should have set off alarm bells louder than it initially did for me, a completed guest registration form that included the child's full legal name, date of birth, home address, the names of both parents or legal guardians, and a current photograph. A photograph of a 7-year-old kept on file by the Homeowners Association. I did not push back further in that moment because I did not want to make a scene in front of my grandchildren, and because 31 years of investigative work had taught me something important. When you find the first loose thread on something that does not add up, you do not yank on it immediately in front of the person who might tighten it back down before you understand what it is connected to. You pull quietly, and you keep pulling until you understand the whole shape of what you are looking at. I told Sherry I would complete the guest registration form for that day so the kids could swim, and I did, filling out Ivy and Nolan's information exactly as required, and I want you to remember that detail because it becomes important later. I gave her real information because at that point I had no reason yet to believe she was going to do anything with it beyond what she claimed. That night after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down with Diane and told her something felt wrong about the whole thing, and I wanted to understand what the actual governing documents of Harrow Meadows said about visitor policies. Because if this was truly a board-approved security measure, it should exist somewhere in writing beyond a laminated sign taped to a gate. The next morning, I called the HOA management office and requested a copy of the current rules and regulations packet along with any recent board meeting minutes where a visitor identification policy might have been discussed and approved. The office administrator, a pleasant woman named Denise Okafor, emailed both documents to me within the hour. I read through 8 months of board meeting minutes looking for any mention of a visitor verification policy, any vote, any discussion, anything at all. There was nothing. Not a single reference to identification requirements, guest registration forms, or photograph collection anywhere in the official record. Whatever this policy was, it had never been brought before the board for a vote. It had never been discussed in an open meeting. It existed nowhere in writing, except on that laminated sign Sherry had taped to the pool gate herself. Under the community bylaws, which I also pulled and read carefully that same day, any new rule affecting resident or guest access to amenities required a majority vote of the board at a properly noticed meeting, with the resulting rule then distributed to residents through the official channels the association used for that purpose, typically the newsletter and the community portal. A single board member, even the president, could not simply implement a new access requirement unilaterally and start collecting personal information from residents and their families without that process being followed. Sherry had skipped every single step of that process, and she had done it in a way that made it look procedural and legitimate to anyone who did not think to check. That alone would have been enough for me to file a formal complaint and push for the policy to be rescinded. But the investigator in me was not satisfied with just knowing the policy was procedurally invalid. I wanted to know why she had done it, because in my experience, people do not go through the effort of creating a fake official-looking form, collecting photographs of children, and maintaining what was clearly becoming a private database just for the fun of feeling important. There was always a reason, usually a self-serving one. I started paying closer attention to Sherry Poplawski herself, not in any way that crossed into anything inappropriate, simply the way any curious neighbor might, by reading the community Facebook group, by noticing what she talked about at the mailbox, by remembering small details from casual conversations over the years. And within about 2 weeks, I found the thread that connected everything. Sherry ran a side business, something she had mentioned in passing more than once at community events, a boutique photography studio that specialized in what she called family lifestyle sessions, the kind of professional photo shoots parents book for birthdays, milestone ages, and seasonal family portraits. She had a modest but active presence advertising this business, a simple website, a social media page with maybe 1,100 followers, mostly local parents in the surrounding area. I want to be careful here, because at this point I still did not have proof of anything beyond a hunch. A woman running a photography business and a woman collecting photographs of children through her HOA position could have been two completely unrelated facts about the same person. I did not want to accuse her of something I could not substantiate, so I did what 31 years of claims investigation had trained me to do. I built a timeline, and I looked for overlap. I pulled the date the laminated sign first appeared at the pool gate, which Diane and I confirmed through a photo Diane had actually taken of it out of annoyance the first weekend it went up, time-stamped on her phone. I compared that date to Sherry's business social media page, scrolling back through her posting history. 17 days after that sign went up, Sherry's photography business page posted an announcement about what she called a new local outreach initiative, offering discounted family photo sessions specifically targeted at families with children ages 5 through 12. The exact age range the guest registration form at the pool gate was overwhelmingly capturing, since Harrow Meadows was a 55 and older primary residency community where grandchildren visiting fell almost entirely within that range. That could still have been coincidence. Business owners run promotions all the time without any sinister connection to unrelated activities. But then I found something that moved this from suspicious to something I could no longer explain away as coincidence. Denise Okafor, the management office administrator, mentioned to me during an unrelated phone call about a completely different matter that Sherry had asked her several weeks earlier whether the management company's database system had an export function for the guest registration forms, specifically asking if the photographs attached to each form could be pulled as a batch rather than viewed one at a time within the portal. Denise, to her credit, told me she had found that request strange enough to remember it clearly, because she could not think of a legitimate HOA administrative reason why anyone would need to export a batch of children's photographs rather than simply viewing individual records when needed for actual verification purposes. She had put Sherry off at the time, telling her the system did not support batch photo exports, which as far as Denise knew was true. I asked Denise, as carefully and neutrally as I could, whether Sherry had access to the guest registration data independent of the management portal, meaning whether Sherry, in her capacity as board president, had any way to view or download that information outside of what Denise controlled. Denise told me that board presidents did have limited administrative access to certain community records, but that photograph data specifically was supposed to be restricted to management company staff only for privacy reasons, unless the board president specifically requested elevated access, which required a documented reason. I asked if Sherry had requested that elevated access. Denise checked and confirmed that she had, roughly 6 weeks before the identification policy sign ever appeared at the pool gate, and the documented reason Sherry had given for needing that elevated access was, and I am going to quote this as closely as Denise relayed it to me, general community safety oversight. Now I had a real timeline, and it told a very different story than the one Sherry had told me at that pool gate. 6 weeks before the sign went up, Sherry requested elevated access to resident photograph data under a vague safety justification that was never brought before the board. The sign then went up unilaterally, without board approval, requiring photographs of every minor guest under policy that did not exist anywhere in the association's official governing documents. And within just over 2 weeks of that policy taking effect, her private photography business began actively promoting sessions targeted at the exact demographic the policy was pulling into that database. I sat with that information for a full day before deciding what to do with it, because I understood that what I was looking at was serious enough that I needed to be completely certain before I brought it forward publicly. An accusation like this, even a well-founded one, can destroy a reputation, and I wanted to make absolutely sure I was not connecting dots that did not actually belong together. So I did one more thing before I moved forward. Something that I think ended up being the single piece of evidence that made everything else undeniable rather than merely suspicious. I submitted a formal written records request to the management company, citing my rights as a homeowner under the state's HOA transparency statute, requesting a complete accounting of who had accessed the guest registration database, when, and for what stated purpose, over the previous 90 days. Under that statute, associations are required to maintain and produce access logs for resident record systems upon a homeowner's written request, specifically because these systems can contain sensitive personal information. It took the management company 12 days to respond, longer than the statute technically allowed, which I noted in a follow-up email, and that follow-up email seemed to move things along considerably faster after that. What came back was an access log showing 41 instances of Sherry Poplawski accessing the photograph database over the previous 10 weeks, at hours and frequencies that went well beyond anything resembling occasional safety oversight. Late evening access, weekend access, multiple sessions lasting over 20 minutes each, well beyond what would be needed to simply verify a child's identity for a same-day pool visit. I had what I needed. I am going to stop the story here. Right at the moment, I sat down to write the email that would eventually force an emergency board meeting, because everything that happened after I sent that email changed the entire trajectory of what this situation became. What started as an inconvenient policy about grandchildren showing identification at a pool gate turned into something that exposed exactly why Sherry Poplawski wanted that list in the first place. And by the time it was over, she would not just lose her position on that board, she would lose the business she had built that database to feed. Part 2 picks up with that email, the emergency meeting it forced, and the moment Sherry Poplawski stood in front of every parent and grandparent in that community and tried to explain why she needed photographs of their children. Thumbnail text. She wanted kids' photos. I found out why.